He found her with trembling hands, holding a cup of tea that she never drank. Her eyes were swollen, but not from sleep, from tears. And yet, she smiled. She smiled like someone who had nothing left, but still refused to let the pain show. He was also destroyed inside, but hidden behind folders, contracts, and a steely posture. That rainy night in the office would be the last one they would be so close, because she saw him cry, and he preferred silence. He didn't have the courage to say, "Stay." And when the heart asks but the mouth doesn't say, destiny makes choices for us, and almost always, it hurts. She wiped her tears and went back to the kitchen, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't heard his muffled crying while he read the marriage contract that would never be signed. He wanted to hold her hand, he wanted to run after her, he wanted to beg her, but pride is a poison that whispers, "She'll come back." And she didn't come back. Not physically, not emotionally. Time passed, and she built the most beautiful silence he had ever known, a silence that years later would echo in that same office. Only now, he was alone, and a song in the background made his chest tighten. It was the song she hummed softly while washing the dishes, and it was there, right there, that he understood. He had lost the only woman who saw his soul, just because he couldn't say a word. If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more people find stories like this. The light in the office was cold and blue, coming from a tall, silent lamp. The rest of the room was in darkness. The closed curtains muffled the sound of the rain outside, but they couldn't hide the smell of reheated coffee that hung in the air. He was sitting at the dark mahogany desk, his sleeves rolled up, his fists clenched, and his forehead resting on his fingers. The papers in front of him were disorganized, but he couldn't see them. His eyes were moist, fixed on nothing. It was as if he were immersed in a time that no longer existed. It was at that moment that she entered. She didn't say anything. She just appeared, silent, with her hair tied up and a cup in her hands. She stopped when she saw the scene, hesitated for a few seconds, and then walked slowly to the desk. She placed the cup next to him without making a sound, but he didn't move. The tears were still there, fighting against his pride. She watched him for a moment longer. She wanted to touch him. She wanted to tell him that he didn't need to hide that pain. But she said nothing. She simply held out a napkin and left it on the table. He took it, still not looking at her. He thanked her in a barely audible whisper, and then she smiled. A small, tired smile, but full of affection. And before he could say anything, she turned and walked out the same door. The lights in the hallway went out one by one, and the sound of her low heels echoed on the wooden floor. He stood there motionless, with his eyes fixed on the empty space where she had been. He thought about calling her. He thought about saying, "Stay," but he didn't, because there were too many things stuck in his throat, unspoken words, swallowed apologies, promises he had never dared to make. Pride, the silent companion of his entire life, squeezed tighter than any feeling, and even though his heart was begging, his mouth remained silent. Outside, the rain was getting heavier. Inside him, a world was collapsing. Years before that silent night in the office, everything had begun almost imperceptibly, like a breeze before a storm. She had arrived at the suggestion of an acquaintance of her aunt, with a modest resume and eyes that carried more dignity than any prestigious diploma. He, heir to a chain of companies that his father had built with an iron fist, had always been reserved, methodical, and distant. His routine was calculated, impersonal, efficient. Hers was careful, attentive, full of small gestures that few noticed, but that touched them. She organized the papers in his office with precision and delicacy. She collected the coffee mugs without interrupting his silence. She went unnoticed by almost everyone, except for him. At first he didn't know why, but there was something in her steps that slowed him down inside. The way she arranged the flowers in the reception area, the way she closed her eyes for a second when she smelled the fresh bread from the building's cafeteria. She seemed to belong to a simpler, truer world, where things didn't need to be said to be felt. He began to notice the details: the hair clip with an old-fashioned design, the worn gloves she took off when she arrived, the notebook where she scribbled recipes, prayers, grocery lists. He didn't know her name for weeks. Until the day she dropped a stack of folders and, as she bent down to help him, she said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas," and he replied, "What's your name again?" She smiled without looking up. "Margaret." That was it. A name said simply. But after that day, something changed. He began to look forward to that brief moment in the morning when she left the tea on the table. He began to leave the room more often just to see her from afar, and she, without anyone knowing, noticed it too. She felt the different weight of that look. It wasn't vulgar, it wasn't invasive. It was a look that sought company, not desire. And that disarmed her. One day, without meaning to, she heard him laugh. A real one. It came from a meeting, but it was rare, and it remained in her memory as a sound she wanted to hear more often. And although they both remained distant, respectful, professional, there was an invisible thread between them that was beginning to form. A thread made of silence, presence, and feelings that could not be put into words. And this thread was already beginning to pull them both towards the same destination. Time passed, and that invisible thread between them became more evident, even if no one dared to comment on it. It was in the details that the feeling grew. When he was late for a meeting and found the teapot still warm on the table. When she passed by in the hallway and he looked away, but a half smile escaped. There were never direct words, nor touches that were not allowed. But what existed between them was more intimate than a hug. It was the exchange of souls that recognized each other in silence. Margaret continued to be the discreet employee, always punctual, always correct. But inside, she began to feel something she could not name. It was not a teenage love, nor a burning passion. It was deeper, a serene desire to stay close, to care without being seen, to exist in his life even without a defined place. He, in turn, began to change in small gestures. He left notes with messages that he could have passed on to others. He asked for her help with paperwork that he did not need to delegate. He called her by her full name, and then by her first name only. "Margaret," he would say, as if delicately testing the sound. Some days he would leave discreet flowers on the kitchen counter. None of them had a card, but she knew. They were simple flowers, the kind she had once said she liked, and even without confirmation, that was enough. There were afternoons when he would pass by the kitchen on the floor unnecessarily, just to see her stirring the teapot or folding napkins. He never said anything, he would just watch. And even without looking at him, she would feel his presence like a warm breeze on the back of her neck. Little by little, they both got used to that silent, complicit, subtle routine, and it was precisely this delicacy that bound them to each other more strongly than any declaration. Neither of them dared to cross the line. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of respect, maybe because they knew that the world outside that office was not kind to stories like theirs. She was the daughter of a seamstress. He was the grandson of bankers. Their universes were parallel and dangerously distant. But inside that building, among the stairs, folders and tall windows, their paths crossed every day. And all it took was a wave, a hot tea, a look held for too many seconds to make their hearts race. It was love, although neither of them dared to call it that, because sometimes what cannot be named hurts less when it's over. What they had was so subtle that no one dared to notice, but the few who knew how to observe noticed, especially his mother. A strict, elegant woman, accustomed to gala settings and restrained smiles, she began to suspect something the moment Margaret was invited to serve at a family dinner. It was just another formal evening, with businessmen, heirs, and guests who spoke arrogantly and chewed as if they were bored with the world. Margaret was in the living room, discreet as always, placing the glasses in their places and serving the dishes with steady hands. And it was there, in that opaque and heavy setting, that she made the only mistake that is unforgivable in environments like that. Existing. She did not trip, did not speak out of turn, did not break anything. She simply existed with too much dignity. And the hostess's son, upon noticing her presence, looked at her softly. That was enough for his mother to tighten her grip on the crystal glass, and out of the corner of her eye, write down the threat. On the way out, when everyone had already left, Margaret heard her name being called, not by the boss, but by the woman who had been pretending she was invisible until then. "You're forgetting your place, aren't you?" the lady said, her voice low but sharp. Margaret didn't answer. She just lowered her head, as if she understood that in that world, not even silence is a sufficient excuse. The next morning, Thomas seemed tense. He avoided her gaze, said little, and when he was finally alone, he asked if she was okay. She said yes, but there was something in his eyes that said otherwise. Guilt, fear, cowardice. He didn't defend her. He knew what her mother had said. He knew she was uncomfortable, but he chose the safer path, and she understood. She always understood, and it was there on that cold day with the smell of papers wet from the rain that something inside her began to break. It was a thin, imperceptible, but deep crack, and although she still served tea, still folded the papers, still smiled with her eyes, Margaret began to withdraw inside. The silent love that I carried in my chest now weighed heavily, because loving someone who feels ashamed to be seen by your side is a pain that makes no noise, but deafens you from within. That week she barely smiled. Her eyes, which had once been so serene, now seemed dull, as if something had gone out inside her. Margaret remained professional, performing her duties perfectly, but her gestures lost their warmth. She no longer lingered for a few extra seconds at the door to his office, nor left discreet flowers in the corner of the kitchen. She began to put the teacup down more quickly, and her eyes, which had once been so communicative, now avoided his. Thomas noticed, and this worried him more than he would like to admit, but he didn't know what to do with his own cowardice. He hadn't known how to protect her when she needed him most, and now he feared it was too late. One day, in the middle of a board meeting, she entered the room by mistake, carrying a document that had been requested by the wrong department. When she noticed the strange looks, she tried to back away, but one of the board members, with sarcasm disguised as charm, commented, "It seems that now even the cleaning ladies want to be part of the decisions." The whole room laughed. So did he. Not with pleasure, not with malice, but with that automatic laugh that comes out when you don't have the courage to face someone. And she just stood there for a second, her eyes shining not with emotion but with embarrassment. She put the envelope on the table, apologized, and left. In the hallway, tears were streaming down her face before she could stop them, but she wiped her face, took a deep breath, and went back to work as if nothing had happened. Thomas sat there with the smile still frozen on his face. A strange feeling took over his chest. It wasn't guilt. It was shame. Ashamed of himself, because he had promised himself that he would never allow her to feel small, and now once again he had failed. That afternoon he had tried to call her to talk, but she said she was busy. For the first time, she refused to let him come, and he understood that he had crossed a line that could not be undone with apologies. There were no fights, no shouting, no accusations, only silence, and her silence screamed louder than any words. The following Monday, he found a letter on his desk. It had no envelope or signature, just a sheet of paper folded in four with firm, calm handwriting. "Mr. Thomas, I thank you for the opportunity. As of next Friday, I will be leaving my position. It has been a privilege to serve the company. I wish you success and peace." He read the note 3 times, as if he could not understand a simple sentence because it hurts too much. He immediately left the room. He looked for her in the hallways, in the cafeteria, in the internal garden where he sometimes saw her eating lunch alone. He found her in the pantry, arranging a porcelain tray with cookies for the meeting area. She was calm, or seemed so. The kind of calm that comes after disappointment, when the soul has already convinced itself that it is not worth fighting. "You can't leave like this," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. She turned her face, but not her eyes. "I am not leaving like this. I am leaving with gratitude." That broke him. He wanted to grab her wrist, stop her from continuing to arrange the pots. But he didn't, because he knew he no longer had that right. "It's not because of what happened at the meeting, is it?" he insisted. She smiled slightly, but without joy. It wasn't just because of that. It was because of everything that never happened too. He wanted to respond, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he stood there, looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, and at the same time as if he knew it would be the last. In the days that followed, she kept coming, fulfilling her shifts perfectly, but she no longer stopped by his office. She didn't leave tea, she didn't leave her presence. Only her absence filled the spaces with more force than before. He tried to write a letter. He gave up. He thought about inviting her to lunch. He gave up. He tried to send flowers, but he found out they were donated to the local hospital. The truth is that Thomas was used to controlling everything except the heart of someone he never had the courage to reach out to. On Friday, she left without ceremony. She simply left her keys on the reception desk and waved to security. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply walked with the dignity of someone who doesn't need to make a fuss to make her presence felt. He watched everything from a second-floor window, and in that moment he understood what he had lost. She wasn't an employee. She was the only woman who had loved him in silence. And yet, she left in peace. Days after her departure, her absence became a glaring presence. The kitchen was colder, the hallways longer, and even the sound of the elevator buttons seemed drier. But it was on her birthday that everything became unbearable. No one knew the date anymore, except him. The year before, she had said by chance, while packing a donation box, "My birthday is on Saturday. I'm going to take a cake to my mother. She still says I'm her gift." And he never forgot. At the time, he didn't have the courage to give her anything. He just left in her locker a small package with an old hand-carved wooden bookmark. No note, no name. But when she walked into the room the following Monday, she looked at him with a silent, knowing smile. And that was enough. Now, a year later, she was gone. And yet Thomas went down to the building's cafeteria, bought the same kind of cake she used to bring, with plain frosting and strawberries, and took it out to the inner garden. He sat on the wrought-iron bench, opened the box, and stood there, the untouched cake in front of him, as if she would still come, as if he could still smile at her gesture. But she didn't. Instead, a sheet of paper fell onto the table, from above, blown by the wind. He picked it up without interest until he noticed something scribbled on the back, a name. Margaret. A child, perhaps, a coincidence, but it was enough to make him smile for a second, his eyes filling with tears. Later that night, he went up to the living room and, opening the drawer, found the bookmark she had discreetly left behind when she left. It was wrapped in an embroidered napkin with a sentence written in pen. "What is true is not lost, but sometimes it is gone." Thomas leaned back in his chair, holding the small object as if it were too fragile for the world. It was all that was left of her. A bookmark, a napkin, and an absence that filled every corner. And yet, in that moment, he felt a strange kind of gratitude, because even though she was leaving, she could still teach him how to feel. Time passed with the merciless delicacy of someone who waits for no one. Margaret started over far away, in a simple neighborhood, opening a small embroidery and fine sewing studio. There was no luxury, no flashy facade, but everything there overflowed with sincere beauty. The fabrics were ironed with care, the embroidery told stories, and the scent of lavender filled the room with a peace she had never found in the marble halls of the past. Loyal customers began to arrive. Women who sought not only repairs but also shelter. Children sat on the rugs and drew while their mothers tried on dresses. Margaret smiled more now. A real smile, the kind that comes from within and doesn't need applause to exist. And even though she didn't talk about the past, it lived on in her long pauses and in the silences between one stitch and another of the needle. Thomas, on the other hand, moved on without ever leaving the same place. He signed contracts, traveled, and made public appearances alongside his chosen bride of convenience, an heiress with an important surname, raised to smile in photos and keep her lineage intact. The wedding was announced with fanfare, but it never happened. The bride realized too soon that she was sharing her space with a ghost, and ghosts, however silent they may be, weigh heavily. The breakup was discreet, wrapped in official notes and well-written apologies. But the truth is that Thomas was never able to give himself over again. Not because there were no other women, but because there was only one whose absence remained, sitting next to him in the car at the back of the meeting room, behind the curtains of the empty apartment. Sometimes he looked for her online. He found photos of her studio, testimonials from clients, images of her with children in her arms. She seemed happy. Not radiant, not theatrical, just at peace. A kind of peace he had never been able to achieve. One autumn afternoon, he decided to drive to the neighborhood where she lived. He stayed in the car on the other side of the street. He saw the simple sign on the door, Line and Soul. He saw her come out with a package in her arms and gently hand it to an elderly lady. And then, before anyone could notice, she started the engine and drove away. Because true love sometimes teaches us not to get in the way. And he knew that, after all, she had found a life that no longer included him. It was on a rainy night, very similar to the one she found him crying in the office, that the past decided to cross their paths once again. Margaret needed to pick up some boxes of old documents from the time she worked for the company, because a bureaucratic issue required proof. She called, made an appointment, and set it for late afternoon, when the building would be almost empty. She didn't expect to see him. She didn't want to. But at the same time, she knew there was a part of her that hadn't been able to say goodbye to all that yet. She arrived wearing a neutral dress, flat shoes, and her hair tied up the same way it always was. The hallways were more modern. The carpet had changed, but the smell was the same. And when she walked through the kitchen, she felt as if an entire life had fit into an instant. She went down to the reception, signed the papers, and was told to go up to the old room to get the files. She went in. The light was on, and he was there, sitting at the same desk, the same heavy shoulders, but with new wrinkles and a more visible emptiness in his eyes. For a second they both stood still, as if time had frozen all around them. She was the first to break the silence. They told me the room would be empty. He took a deep breath, stood up slowly, not knowing what to do with his hands. I didn't know you were coming either. She approached the bookshelf, calmly picked up the box, and then, as she was about to leave, he said softly, almost like a forgotten whisper, "Do you still dream?" About that bookmark. She stopped. He didn't turn his face away, but his eyes welled up inside. "I dreamed more when you pretended not to see me." He closed his eyes, pressing his fingers against the table. The room was full of memories, but none were enough to fix what one didn't have the courage to live. "You look so happy in the photos. I thought—" She interrupted him gently. "I thought if I looked happy, you wouldn't feel so guilty." And then he smiled, not with anger, with understanding. And that hurt more than any accusation. He handed him a small box. "There's something here that was left behind." He opened it. Inside was a ribbon of fabric with his initials embroidered by her. Never given, never used. "It was a gift I wanted to give you when you were mine." And then, without waiting for an answer, she turned and left, leaving once again only silence to take care of him. After that encounter, Thomas began to walk more slowly through the corridors of his own empire. The same. Corridors that he had previously walked through with haste and indifference now seemed too long, filled with silent memories. He began to avoid his office, and when he entered it, he would leave the door open, as if hoping that the wind would bring back the sound of footsteps that would never return. At night, the files were there, piled on the table, but he did not read them. His eyes remained fixed on the embroidered ribbon that he now kept in the top drawer. He touched the fabric with his fingers as if he could somehow go back in time. But he did not go back. Time only moved forward, and pride, that was always faster. On a grey Tuesday morning, while watching the people moving through the window, Thomas received an envelope. It was from the marketing department. Inside, a proposal for a social campaign involving local seamstresses and stories of overcoming. In one of the attached photos, a woman with a headscarf smiled with her hands full of needle and thread. Behind her, on the studio wall, a smaller image, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. Margaret. He carefully picked up the paper, enlarged the image with his fingers, and stood there, observing. Her smile was serene, her eyes seemed more mature, and there was an atmosphere in the room that no project of his had ever managed to create. It was the portrait of a life built without haste, with scars embroidered in peace. Then he closed his eyes and realized what he had always known, but never had the courage to admit. She was everything he had never been able to be, true, light, free. And perhaps that was exactly what paralyzed him, because loving someone like that takes courage, it takes baring your soul, and he had never known how to do that. Later that same day, Thomas got in his car and drove to the neighborhood where she lived. He stopped in front of the studio, got out, but did not go in. He just leaned on the hood and watched the movement. Some children ran by, a man waved into the store, and finally she appeared, helping a pregnant woman up the sidewalk. Her hair tied up, her apron stained with thread, and her eyes the same. He smiled from afar. She didn't see him. And that was okay, because for the first time he felt that his presence wasn't necessary for her to blossom. She blossomed on her own, and that was the hardest lesson love could give her. Over time, Thomas began to visit that neighborhood frequently, but never by the same route. Sometimes he would park 3 blocks away and walk, as if his body wanted to get there without his mind noticing. Other times he would simply cross the street in front of the studio, as if he were passing by chance. He never went in. He never called out, but he would watch. And in every gesture she made, he saw the woman he had let slip through his fingers out of fear or cowardice. One afternoon, while walking through a craft fair held in the central square, he heard familiar laughter and decided to approach her. And there she was, in a modest stall, selling cloths embroidered with messages of faith, courage, and silence. Children played around her, and a young woman hugged her tenderly, calling her Aunt Margaret. He stood there at a distance, watching the lightness with which she touched people. There was no shadow in her presence, only light, and that hurt. It hurt because he knew that by his side she had cried alone. She had felt ashamed. She had been invisible. And yet, he didn't harden. He didn't shut himself down. He didn't become bitter. That was tearing him apart inside. A few days later, he returned to the company building and for the first time decided to go into the old kitchen. The place was renovated, modern, impersonal, but in one of the forgotten drawers, he found a dish towel that she had embroidered with a simple phrase, "Kindness is the silence that heals." He sat right there and held that cloth as if holding a piece of life. That night, he wrote a letter, not with the intention of giving it to her. He just wrote. In it, he told her everything he had never had the courage to say. He spoke of the day she saw him cry, and he pretended it was nothing. Of the moment he wanted to hold her, but chose silence. Of the pain of not having defended her, and of the love he never dared to confess. He folded the letter, put it in a folder, and locked it in the bottom drawer of the bookcase. No one ever read it. But writing was like admitting to himself that he had lost. Not by fate, but by choice. The following week he received an invitation to a charity event held by the local city hall, and there was her name among those honored, for her silent work in favor of women's dignity. He attended. He sat in the back without telling anyone, and when she took the stage, simple as always in a light dress and with her hair loose, he felt his chest ache with pride and regret. She thanked him with a smile, said little, and quoted a phrase he would never forget. "We never lose those we love. We only learn to love too late." A few weeks after the event, time seemed to have settled around the memories, like someone who understands that there are pains that cannot be cured, only carried with more delicacy. Margaret continued with her studio, her commissions, her silences filled with embroidery and coffees sweetened with affection. But something unexpected happened on an ordinary afternoon. While organizing a box of fabrics donated by a former client, she found An old book of poems. It was among scraps of lace and old magazines forgotten. When she opened it, she saw a yellowed page fall out. It was a letter, and the handwriting was his. Thomas. The name was not signed, but the recognition was immediate. Her heart raced before she even began to read. The words were simple but intense. He told her about the night he cried, about the day he almost asked her to stay, about the times he saw her leave and didn't have the courage to run after her. He said he had embroidered her absence in every gesture over the last few years, and that if she ever read it, it was because God still wanted her to know that she was loved, even if it was late. Margaret sat in silence for minutes that were too long. The world seemed to have stopped, just so she could breathe in that revelation. She didn't cry or smile. She just closed her eyes and held the letter with both hands, like someone holding the end of a cycle that no longer needs to hurt. She put the paper inside a little wooden box where she kept special mementos. She didn't answer. She didn't look for it. She didn't need to, because there was everything she needed, the truth that had never come out in words, but now finally existed on paper. And the truth, even if delayed, can sometimes still heal. In another part of the city, he never knew that the letter had been found, but he started to sleep better, as if something inside him had been heard, even in the silence. Little by little, he stopped, visiting the neighborhood, not out of indifference but out of respect, because he understood that she no longer needed to be remembered to be eternal. She was already gone. In every choice, in every kind gesture, in every life she touched with her embroidery and her calm. And even far away, even without a name, she continued to be the most human part of him he had ever known. The woman who wiped his tears in the dark and, even hurt, returned to the kitchen with dignity. The woman who asked for nothing, but gave everything. Years passed. The city changed slowly, as the seasons change in places where haste has never been welcome. Margaret aged lightly. Her hair began to turn grey, but her eyes remained clear, steady, full of tenderness. The studio continued to operate, now with the help of 2 young apprentices, and there was a new mural on the wall. Photos of clients, embroidered phrases, and a small black and white image of a man sitting alone at a table with a forgotten cup of tea. No one knew who it was. She never explained it either. She would just say, "This image reminds me of what it takes to let go, even when you love," and she would go back to work. Across town, Thomas was no longer in charge of the company. He had handed over the leadership to an ambitious nephew and returned to his old office only as an occasional advisor. His days were calmer now. His routine included slow walks, books left half-finished, and a cup always placed on the edge of the shelf, as if he were waiting for company. He never loved again. He never cried again, but there was a different serenity in his eyes, the serenity of someone who had finally understood the price of silence. One day, he decided to visit the old warehouse where he had stored pieces and objects from the company's early years. Rummaging through dusty boxes, he found a forgotten frame covered by a thin sheet. When he removed the cloth, he saw the embroidery she had left years ago without saying anything. "If you ever have the courage to love me, it will be too late. But still, thank you for crying for me." Time stopped at that moment. He sat right there, on a cardboard box, with the painting on his lap. There was no one around, no music, no specific memories, only the absolute certainty that that sentence was the end of everything, an end with no return, but with dignity. He returned home with the painting in his hands. He placed it on the wall of his office, not as a decoration, but as a reminder of what was not lived out of pride, of the woman who left not for lack of love but for too much silence. That same night, as he looked out the window at the calm movement of the street, he saw a boy passing by selling flowers. He asked him to come up. He bought them all, and he placed them in a makeshift vase right next to the painting. They were white dahlias, the same ones she said she liked, but that he never had the courage to give her. For the first time, he lit a candle. Not out of mourning, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for what he had and did not experience, for what he loved and lost. for the only woman who had seen him naked without him having to undress. The next day, his nephew came into his room and found everything in its place except him. Thomas had left that morning sitting with his eyes closed, a half smile on his lips and the bookmark in his hand, and no one understood why, in his will, he left a simple request as the last sentence. If there is still time, give her this bookmark, and tell her that I have finally learned to love. She received the news with tears in her eyes and a silent heart. He carefully picked up the bookmark, placed it between the pages of his favorite book, and simply murmured, "It was late, but not in vain." If this story touched your heart, leave a like so that more people can feel what you felt. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Each one holds a truth that transforms. And now tell me, in the comments, do you believe that true love can arrive and too late? I'm reading everything. And if you haven't seen the video that's appearing on the screen now, click and watch it. It's a story that might speak exactly to what you're feeling today.